Hey everybody, it's Rabbit, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be looking at the best French tank in the game of War Thunder. Now, as a quick reminder of the rules for this series, we will not be looking at anti-aircraft vehicles, we'll only be looking at vehicles in the mainline tech tree, and we will be looking at a composite of both the win rate and the kills per death. The top vehicles in terms of win rate for France right now are number 1, the Leopard 2A6 NL, number 2, the Leclerc Azure, number 3, the MSC, number 4, the VBCI, and number 5, the Leopard 2A4 NL. In terms of kills per death, the number 1 tank is the MSC, the number 2 is the Char 2C, the number 3 is the Leopard 2A6 NL, the number 4 is the AMX-50 Surb SA, and the number 5 is the AMX-50 TOA 100. Now, the way I generally weight the score is I give the tanks 1 point per their placing in the chart, and then I add up their placing in win rate and in kills per death, and whoever has the lowest score wins. And this creates a bit of an issue because if you can do some quick math, both the MSC and the Leopard 2A6NL have essentially a total of 4 points. The MSC is number 1 on kills per death and number 3 on win rate, whereas the 2A6NL is number 1 on win rate and number 3 in kills per death. So this is in point of fact a two-way tie between these two vehicles. The MSC is currently boasting a win rate of 56.6% with a kills per death of 1.59. The Leopard 2A6NL is currently posting a win rate of 58.4% and a kills per death of 1.52. So both of these vehicles are actually very close to each other in terms of kills per death and in terms of win rate, which in general does mean they are both quite effective for their battle rating, at least in the hands of your average French player. Now, when comparing the overall mobility of these two vehicles, you will see some pretty noticeable similarities. Both of them have a 1500 horsepower engine. The MSC has a 70 kph top speed forward and a 38 in reverse, whereas the Leopard 2A6NL has a 68 kph top speed forward and a 31 in reverse. So both of them have generally high top speeds in forward and reverse, and both of them feature a 1500 horsepower engine, which is pretty beefy. The MSC, however, does beat out the Leopard 2A6NL because the Leopard 2A6NL is a whopping 59.9 tons, whereas the MSC is a whole 6 tons lighter at 53.9 tons. So the MSC has noticeably more acceleration and noticeably better power to weight for handling soft and rough ground. In general, this means the MSC will feel a lot closer in terms of its overall power to weight ratio to something like a light tank, whereas the 2A6NL feels closer to a more traditional heavy tank. The MSC is actually lighter than basically every version of the Abrams as well. It is an incredibly lightweight vehicle, especially given how beefy its engine is. In terms of armor, this is one of those areas where we see the biggest division between the two vehicles. The Leopard 2A6NL has turret cheeks that can resist the vast majority of shells in the game, and its upper front plate can bounce most shells as well, with very few exceptions. In this respect, the Leopard 2A6NL is a very difficult target if it is hull down behind terrain, almost irrespective of which enemy it's actually fighting. This makes the Leopard 2A6NL an excellent sniper. Additionally, it does have a pretty decent internal damage model, although this was nerfed fairly recently with the addition of the large turret basket that functions as a turret ring. The Leopard 2A6NL and the MSC also feature no ammunition within the hull as long as you don't take more than a set number of rounds. For the 2A6NL, this is 15 rounds in the magazine plus 1 in the chamber. The MSC has noticeably less armor, at least noticeably less consistent armor. That's not to say you will never block shells. The front of the turret face and the upper front plate can be kind of trolly at times. However, you're never consistently safe even while hull down in the MSC, especially against some of the higher penetration shells that you can potentially fight. The MSC definitely relies a lot more on its agility to get into annoying positions and do a lot of damage, rather than simply tanking shells or stopping them entirely. That being said, the MSC, unlike the 2A6NL, does have a major advantage in that, well, it's not German, it's French, and Gaijin doesn't care as much about nerfing French vehicles. The MSC, much like the Leclerc family, doesn't have a large turret basket that artificially nerfs its turret ring, so it is fairly common for the MSC to survive hits in a condition where it can still return fire, whereas the 2A6NL does kind of have issues with that at times, especially because if the engine and turret ring gets knocked out, it can't shoot back. While the MSC, if it does get penned, as long as it doesn't lose 2 out of its 3 crew members, is still pretty good. This does also raise the other issue in that the MSC does only have 3 crew members because it has an autoloader. However, in most instances, this doesn't really make that much of a difference in terms of your overall durability, given that your armor is pretty inconsistent. While the MSC also features no ammunition in the hull as long as you take less than a set number of rounds, the MSC's turret bustle rack holds a whopping 24 rounds, so the MSC can actually boast a whole 25 rounds before you start getting ammo out of the turret basket, which means the MSC is at much lower risk of ammo explosion, especially if you're taking a larger inventory of shells. While the autoloader on the MSC can sometimes get damaged, I have noticed anecdotally that the autoloader functions more as additional armor for your shells to prevent unfortunate cook-offs rather than to actually function as a nerf to disadvantage the tank, much like how it does on a lot of the Russian tanks. In terms of the overall guns, this is where we see one small area where the MSC does pull away from the 2A6NL even despite them being separated by battle rating, and that is the MSC actually has a 50 cal mounted coaxially instead of a normal 7.62 machine gun, much like the Leclerc family. So you do generally have access to a 50 cal to take on some light vehicles with relative ease, whereas the 2A6NL doesn't really have that option, and both of them have fairly basic roof-mounted machine guns. While both tanks feature a 120mm gun, the ammunition they have available is pretty different. Both of them have a fairly basic HeatFS round that is pretty unremarkable. Unfortunately for the MSC, it is stuck with this HeatFS round until it gets all the way up to rank 3 where it unlocks its one and only dart, whereas the 2A6NL actually starts with a dart DM33, so unlike the MSC, the Leopard 2A6NL is not forced to get by with chemical rounds against enemies that increasingly feature an obnoxious amount of explosive reactive armor and other chemical protection. The top APFS DS for the MSC is the OFL 120G1, which features a maximum penetration of 425mm, which is actually quite good for 10.7. There aren't a ton of tanks that really beat it at that battle rating, and this is actually incredibly good, especially combined with the fixed 6-second reload that you get from the autoloader. This means that the MSC has an incredibly punchy gun for its battle rating. It's not exactly what you would call a lull pen gun, but it is certainly good in most situations, and you will find very few, if any, enemies that you can't compete with, even in a max up tier. Additionally, while it doesn't have the 5-second reload of the Leclerc family, a 6-second at this battle rating is still good enough to beat basically everything you'll commonly fight outside of the M1 Abrams and the Type 90s. The Leopard 2A6NL, on the other hand, starts with a dart stock, so it doesn't have to worry about the stock grind, at least not in that area. DM33 that pens almost 500mm, which is actually quite good, especially as a starter dart. You don't necessarily need to upgrade, but the top dart on the Leopard 2A6 is incredibly good. Speaking of, DM53 is currently the highest penetrating kinetic round you can get, at least in a mainline tech tree. There are some event vehicles that beat it, but no other nation really has a shell that does more penetration than DM53 from the L55 gun specifically. On top of that, the reload for the Leopard 2A6 gets all the way down to 6-second ace, with 6.3 experted still being pretty respectable. It is good enough in most situations, although increasingly at top tier 5 to 6 second reloads are a lot more common. Both tanks have access to all the basic stuff you would expect for an MBT of these battle ratings. They all have stabilizers, laser rangefinders, thermal imaging, and smoke grenades, so no real qualms there. The Leopard 2A6, however, does have a nice commander's thermal viewing system, which is pretty effective, especially if you need to scan an area quickly or just want to poke it over a hill to see if you can spot enemies. So giving some overall thoughts on these vehicles and why they're performing so well, and the MSC, it's not hard to see why it's performing well. In fact, it was just added with the Leviathan's update, and if you go back and look at my Leviathan's review, I bet $100 the MSC would be going up in battle rating. It's just a nice, fast, mobile tank. The reload's pretty solid, the shell's pretty solid, the armor is trolly. There's really nothing else you need to have a good tank at this battle rating, and the MSC just feels really good to play. It is overall a very well-rounded MBT, and especially in the hands of the more experienced, on average, French players, it's not hard to see why this is such an effective tank. To top it off, the MSC is backed up by some pretty good offerings in both the Vectra 105 and the Leopard 2A4NL at its battle rating that create a pretty well-rounded lineup, especially in conjunction with some of the air and anti-air options they also have available. So it's not hard to see not just why the MSC itself is good, but why it's having such a good win rate when it's flanked by other vehicles that are themselves quite effective as well. The Dutch Leopard 2A6 is also pretty easy to see why it's good. I gave the Leopard 2A6 positive scores in both my German and Swedish reviews as being one of the vehicles that you should have in your lineup. DM53 from the L55 gun does meet several thresholds. It also has enough penetration to be more consistent, especially if you're pretty close or the enemy is at an awkward angle. On top of that, as it is one of the lighter Leopards you can get at top tier outside of only the Leopard 2A5 really beating it out, it does noticeably have better mobility, even if it's only slightly so, than many of its sister Leopards. On top of that, France has a pretty effective top tier lineup right now, where it is currently flanked by the MSC's older sisters in the form of the Leclerc family, on top of also having a decent-ish anti-air, but really some great air in terms of the Rafale and the Tiger Hod Block 2. And rounding out French top tier is the recently buffed Vextra, which is currently flanking both the MSC and the 2A6NL in their lineups as their mobile support light tank. The Leo 2A6 in general is just a very underrated tank in the game right now, in my humble opinion, because while there are other tanks that are flashier and have more upgrades and more features, the 2A6 really has everything you need to be effective and doesn't have any bonus stuff that you don't or that's very situational. It doesn't waste any additional weight adding features that may or may not be helpful depending on what type of situation you find yourself in, and that's part of the reason why I really like the Leopard 2A6, and also part of the reason why I'm not surprised to see it doing well. Of course, those are just my thoughts on the matter. Let me know what you think in the comments down below about the MSC and the Leopard 2A6NL. Did you think we would have a two-way tie? Did it surprise you? What do you think of these vehicles? I always love to hear from you guys. If you liked the video, found it entertaining, a like and subscribe always helps out the channel. As always, danke bitte, tschüss.